Tansa mananto. Okay. Nisto na ko natui ko kito kana eximatsim po. Dara nastara sese natui ko ata. It's always a pleasure to come to Treaty 6 territory. I have been here several times, and I like to share things, some of the teachings that I received all my life. And I know Treaty 6 peoples are always interested in learning more about the treaty, which is very dear to my heart, as well as many of you. So I want to talk about treaty in respect to what is our relationship with Canada. Because I feel like today we are at a very dangerous part of our lives, or important part of our lives, where we as Indigenous peoples, as the Cree, the Tsuut'ina, the Blackfoot, everyone else, need to take a stand and be who we are, who the Creator, the life that the Creator gave us. This morning, we had a good teaching from Elder O'Cheese. Okama Fox spoke. And to me, I thought, it's very difficult to follow these. However, I will do my best, and I want to share some of my thoughts, because I believe that today is so important that we use our authority as Indigenous peoples. If we are not happy with the relationship that we have with Canada, then we must speak on it. We must tell Canada, no, you are not signatory to our treaties. Treaty trumps domestic law. We need to tell that to the government of Canada, because as you know, and I'll tell you a little bit about treaty from my perspective. Our treaties, from treaties 1 to 11, cover 54% of the landmass of what is now called Canada. If it weren't for those treaties with the Imperial Crown, those territories would not be a part of Canada. So when you enter into a treaty, it's usually a benefit for both parties, mutual benefit for both parties. There's obligations and there's benefits. Our obligation was to share our territory with the settler people. This morning, Elder O'Cheese said 6 inches. When I was traveling from southern Alberta to northern Alberta, across the country, all the elders that I heard speak, they used to make this sign. That's only how much we agreed to share with the newcomers. That was consistent. Because at the time, there was no such a thing as inches, miles, etc. There were no measurements. Our peoples retained certain portions of their territory for their exclusive use, so that their peoples can continue their way of life, their history, their identity of who they are, their right of self-determination, their right to their lawmaking authority, their right to their governance, their right to continue their languages, the right to continue their ceremonies, their culture, everything of what the Creator gave us. They were to do that. That was the understanding of our treaties. And our obligation was to share our territory. The newcomers, the Crown promised their benefit was to use some of our territory, And in exchange, they would provide us as to what we refer to as treaty rights today, like education, health, housing, economic development, and so forth. That was the promises of treaty. But we all know, in 1876, Canada enacted the Federal Indian Act. Their sole goal was to take title to our territories. That was their intent then. It still is today. And in order to do that, they had to get rid of the indigenous peoples because we were the first occupants of our territories, the territories that our Creator gave us. That was their intent. So when the Indian Act was legislated, they stripped our peoples of their right of self-determination. They took their culture, their identity, their language. We were nations. We are peoples. We have territory. We have our languages. We have a right of self-determination. We had our own systems of government. We were survivors. Canada, that's the benefit of our treaties, they don't have their own language. They don't possess historic continuity on our territories. We do. They bring their peoples with languages that are alien to our territory. The language, English language, comes from Great Britain. French comes from France, and so forth. Canadians were not put here with their own languages and their own identity. It's a multicultural society. But we have that authority. We have our own identity. So it was very important this morning when the elder was telling us about the creation story of who we are, what we are. I still have to learn from him to really understand what he's teaching us. We have an oral history. What we learn, we pass down to our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, and that continued all these years. But that stopped when those federal legislations started impacting our lives, and that's the Indian Act. They brought in the blankets, the infested blankets, to get rid of us, to get sick. I can never remember what is it. Anyway, to get sick. They established the Indian residential schools where our peoples couldn't speak their language. They were deprived of their ceremonies. They were not allowed to learn their history, their culture, their identity. And there were many abuses in those residential schools, whether it was mental, physical, sexual, or other abuses. So when we were kids, and I was in residential school for 9 years, I went to school not knowing other than yes or no in the English language. I went to school, was not allowed to speak my language, but we used to sneak and talk because that was the only way I could communicate. But we were punished. So I did not learn what my history is. But I was very fortunate that my late father took the time to teach us. My father, my dear father, Howard Beebe Sr., taught me of who I am and what my history is. He told me at a very young age, you're not going to be satisfied just being a mother and being a wife and a mother and grandmother. You're not going to be happy. And he was right, because I don't like the kitchen. I don't like to cook, but I like to eat. So what he did was He was involved with the Indian Association of Alberta. He would take me as a young child to these Indian Association meetings where the chiefs, the councillors, the elders, the peoples, the youths all gathered. And the executive of the Indian Association would give a report as to what was happening in the state of Canada on how it was impacting our treaties. So he'd take me to those meetings so I can begin to understand or to hear. And I can assure you, as a child, even as a young adult, sometimes I didn't listen. I got 2 years, but I got one mouth. My one mouth worked harder than my 2 years. So that's me. That was me. So I learned as a young child. I got to know the Crees, the Chippewas, the Stonies, the Nakota peoples, the Dene. I got to meet people and I made friends. And they would get together and they would talk. So today, he told me, if you don't know who you are and what your history is, you're going to be very dangerous to our peoples. Today, I know what he meant by that. If I didn't know my history, if I didn't know who I am, I would be right there accepting that 10-year grant. I would be right there encouraging those legislations because they impact on our inherent rights that are protected by treaty. So I am thankful to my late father, my mother, all the elders that have taught me over the years. Because now I understand what the treaty is all about. And like it was said this morning, the Rowam Belt, we were to live side by side with the newcomers without interference. And as you know, they've interfered in our lives through their legislations all these years, since the time of entering into Treaty 1 to Treaty 11 and today. They have done that. And it's all through legislation and policy. And then, in the 60s, and before that, when our peoples, and because the plow, and there was economic development, because our peoples were going to stay in the areas that were exclusively for their use to continue their way of life, they became very good farmers. The plow and the cow came. Well, that's economic development. Then the neighboring farmers, they got so good at farming, the neighboring people, the newcomers started complaining, so that was stopped. That was a treaty, right? That was one of the benefits. In the 60s, and even before that, they started taking our babies from the mothers. So putting them in homes that had no connection to our peoples. So they didn't know who they were. They didn't know their identity. They never had the opportunity to learn about their territory. We have many of those children that are out now, and some have found their way back home. Last week, we just met with one of the girls that was taken from our reserve. Mind you, she found out who she was and she made her connections through the Indian Association of Alberta. That's who she contacted. But now she knows her roots, she knows her community. We had one too at Sutton a few years back, a young guy. Now he's back home. But I do wonder how many of our children are still out there that don't know who they are, what their roots are, what their history is. And yet, we as Indigenous peoples, our children were so important because at a very young age, we start to teach these children about their responsibilities, their identity, their everything. Okay, I'll drink. We teach them. A child was raised in the whole community. A child was protected by the community. But through legislations, now under the provincial laws, which the Indian Act says, all laws of general application apply, subject to treaty and other federal legislation. Because we had an oral history, we had our traditional laws that were not written down, they said there's a gap here, so the provincial laws are going to apply to you. Because under the criminal code, the Canadian federal government gave that responsibility to the provinces over child welfare, education, health, and so forth. But that was to the Alberta citizens. Wasn't us, not according to treaty, if we understand treaty, because we had our own systems. And we never agreed, our peoples never agreed to that, but they put us in there. Then the Indian Affairs were there. So at the time of treaty, that responsibility to fulfill the obligations of treaty was given to then called the central government, who is now the federal government. But through Section 88 of the Indian Act, they said all laws of general application apply. So we have to develop our law. People say today, we talk treaty all the time. What are we going to do? What's the next step? Well, it is evident that Canada does not recognize unwritten law. Even though in their court systems they said you have to give liberal interpretation to the Indians on their understanding of treaty. But when it came to that, did they really accept it? No. Everything has to be written down. So our peoples have been struggling all these years to get our treaties recognized, to get our inherent rights recognized. In 1969, Pierre Trudeau did the white paper, and we know all about that, where he wanted to make the Indians same as the rest of the Canadians. He said that was fairness. That was not fairness to us. He wanted to make us municipalities with no special rights. He wanted our lands to be in our total control so that we can pay taxes, just like any other municipality. That's what he did. Well, and we thought, because the Indian Association and other organizations and other tribes argued against the white paper, we thought, well, it stopped. Well, it did not stop. Many of us know that. They just did it in a more elaborate form. And it continues with all of these legislations that affect us and that are done without our consent. Even in the white paper, they said, we will go to organizations. We'll go to organizations and get them involved. That's what Justin Trudeau does today. We have the AFN, who's supposed to protect our rights, be an advocacy group for us treaty Indians. But no, they get into agreements with the federal government, so their organizations can get more money. They consult, they have engagement sessions along with the federal government, and then they hear from us individually. Don't forget, we have collective rights apart from the individual rights of Canada, of the state of Canada. We have collective rights, and out of those collective rights, we enjoy our individual rights. Our territory belonged to the whole tribe. They were free to hunt, fish, trap, gather, everything in their territory. That was a collective right. The Indian Act said You could give certificates of possession, trying to break up the land, like they did trying to get rid of us. Break up the land, give individuals their lands so they have title to them. Some of our tribes did that, but some didn't. I'll use the example, the Blackfeet in Montana. They had all of their lands. They had collective rights. And like the Indian Act, the United States government, the Indian Act in our territory, when our women married a non-Indigenous person, they were taken off the ban list. We called them ban lists at the time. They took them off. But in the United States, if they married a white man or a non-Indigenous person, and they had title to their territories. So when the woman passes on, her will would give that land to her husband, who is a non-Indian, non-Blackfoot. So their reserve was like a checkerboard. They didn't have that collective right anymore, and it was all checkerboard. Some were individually owned. In the 80s, when we met with them, they informed us when we were doing our citizenship code, they said, be careful, because this is what happened to us. Our women and our men married non-Indigenous peoples. In their wills, they were passed on to them, the lands. Now, we're in the process of trying to buy back all that land that collectively belongs to our peoples. They warned us about that. So, and they're taxable once they do that. So we have to be careful on how we proceed with the state of Canada and how they deal with us, with their laws. So now they're going to get rid of the Indian Act. True. The Indian Act took away our authority. I don't believe in the Indian Act. But having said that, I look at what's in that Indian Act. Our territories, our lands, the management of them are put into the Indian Act. We're tax exempt under the Indian Act. We have treaties, but a nation cannot tax another nation. That's obvious to us. However, Canada does not have that written anywhere except the Indian Act. There's a fiduciary obligation on the Crown, from the Crown, which is the responsibility of the federal government, that there will always be Indians and lands reserved for Indians. That's in the British North America Act. So you look at that British North America Act, and instead of Canada legislating their responsibility to pay for the promises of treaties, they took away our authority. They took away our authority and imposed the Indian Act on us so that we are nothing. So we need to correct that. And as raised, as long as the sun shines, the rivers, the waters flow, and the grass grows, there should be always Indians and lands reserved for Indians. And now, if you look at that, now you look at what the federal government is doing. They're doing away with the Indian Act. What are we going to do about those fiduciary obligations? But at the same time, I said they're doing it in a more elaborate way. They're doing the Financial Management Act, the Lands Management Act, the Tax Commission, which they hired our own people from across the country to sit on those boards and those commissions to do their work. They delegate that authority, so they indirectly delegate that authority to us. Who is the state of Canada to give us that delegated authority when we already have it? We got to, and it was said this morning, we got to believe in ourselves. We got to believe in our authority. If we don't, Where's our future generation going to be? Where's our grandchildren's great-great-great-grandchildren going to be? Are they going to be paying taxes? Are they going to be just Canadians? We have to think about that. What are we going to do? Because our decisions today impacts the future, not just us. And that's what we're taught. You don't just look at what your immediate needs are. You think of the long-term consequences of your decisions and actions. So we got to think that. So this is why I'm very happy to see the Samson Cree Nation getting their peoples together and listening, because you got to take action. You want to save your peoples, you have to take action. You have to strategize. And that responsibility that the treaties are here, as long as the sun shines, the waters flows, and the grass grows, is also our responsibility and not just the state of Canada. It's not. It's ours. If our forefathers did not enter into treaty, where would we be today? Think about that. So now we know the imposition of all those laws that have been impacting our inherent and treaty rights and our treaty. What are we going to do about it? We have the authority to say no to the state of Canada. We have a free, prior, and informed consent, as was told to us, as in the Declaration. We have all the tools that we need. The UN study was done in the 90s, that the treaties are still in existence. We have the Declaration. A couple years back, Minister Bennett said to the world at the UN, Canada, as we know, well, I should back up a bit. Before that, the Harper government did not want to accept the Declaration because it had an imposition, or it impacted the lands and the resources. And he didn't like some of the languages. So did the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. Finally, now they have accepted it. However, here in Canada, Minister Bennett said to the UN, Canada adopts the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples without qualification. That's what she said at the UN. But we know today it's in the Senate. And then apparently they've been trying to get it into legislation, so that's Canada's law, so they couldn't adopt it and fully implement it. But now it's in the Senate. That is one legislation that I agree with, that looks at the responsibilities of Canada for themselves. We have a right of self-determination. We have a right to government. We have a right to a lawmaking authority. We have a right to our own justice systems, which we have to put back in place. And only us can do that. The Declaration states that the state has to provide mechanisms for all the things that they destroyed. They destroyed our institutions of family, of government, of lawmaking authority, our justice system. Now, they call it reconciliation. Let's do it. We have the opportunity, we have all the tools that we need to make this happen so that our children in the future can continue and to really benefit from the treaties that were entered into by our forefathers. We need to know who we are. And I empower all of you. Chief and council are not the only ones responsible for a nation. All their citizens are responsible. We are all responsible. We might have different perspectives. Sit down and strategize on how you're going to move forward. Because what we are doing today is not just for us. It's for as long as the sun shines, the rivers flow, and the grass grows. That's what it's for. This morning, too, a little thing was talked about because of our treaties about our territories, sharing our territory. Okama Fox mentioned the treaty cards. At the time of treaty, they had a treaty pay list. All the headmen and our chiefs would say, these are my people. They went up, because that $5 was not for the sale of the land. It was a greeting gift. That greeting gift, and it was part of our culture. When you invite somebody or somebody comes to visit, you give them a gift. Either way. Well, that $5 was a greeting gift from the understanding of our peoples. So they had a treaty pay list. And the headmen would say, these are my people, and they'd write their names on them. And they got the $5. In 1951, Canada took away the treaty cards. And those treaty cards tie us to our treaties of the land, regarding the land. That's the only thing that ties us. So when and then they put in the status cards. When the last treaty Indian or indigenous person, well, I say Indians because all their constitutional instruments refer to us as Indians. They do. And until that is changed, and at the same time, I have to say, I am very afraid to open the constitutional talks to change those, because they could take away all our rights. They could take away the recognition of our inherent and treaty rights, which we have to define ourselves, not Canada that has been doing that. So when the last treaty Indian, who was born before September the 4th, 1951 passes, there will be no more treaty Indians according to Canada. How many treaty Indians are in here? I mean, real treaties born before 1951, September 4th. There's a few. I am too. My kids are not treaty Indians, they're status Indians, like according to the state of Canada. We wanted to change that back to treaty cards. And we were here. We were here a year ago, 2 years ago. We were promoting, and I have to say this, many of the Crees from here signed that petition to reinstate the treaty cards and get rid of the status cards. Because the status cards have a termination date. Our treaty cards didn't. They were just passed on to our descendants. We were to submit that. We only got just over 1,500 signatures. We couldn't get the signatures, and to me, it told me that our peoples did not understand treaty. They didn't know what it was all about. And yet, when that MP said in the House, get rid of your status cards in exchange for a Canadian passport, that same day, 15,000 Indians signed that petition. How sad is that? We want to support a status card that doesn't tie us to our territory, that doesn't recognize us as nations, over a treaty card that recognizes our treaties because of the land, and we are as nations. So we got to learn. We have to learn. I get very anxious. I'm getting very anxious because I'm getting old. I was there at treaty making jokes. I'm getting very old. And I want our people to learn so we can continue this work so that our 7 generations, even further than that, our children can still be indigenous peoples of their nations, that they'll still have their territories, and they'll be enjoying the benefits of treaty according to its spirit and intent. We need to do that. I don't know, maybe I'm over my time. But those are the things that we got to look at. I don't know if I'm going to be here tomorrow, but you're all listening. So I expect you guys to teach others from what you heard in the last 2 days and tomorrow. You had different speakers tell you different things. But the treaty is important to us. Yesterday, Colby said, the treaty is not dangerous to us. It's the state that is. The state does not have the authority we have. So let's use it. And again, I'd like to thank my overtime. What? 20 minutes? Oh my goodness. So anyway, so those are the things that we need to do.
It's up to you. If you want to keep going, if you want to quit, whatever, it's up to you.
I'm just about done.
Okay.
We have a lot of work to do. We have to start writing down our laws. We at Sotina are developing our laws. Oh, we were Russian because we didn't want the matrimonial law property to be, the federal matrimonial law property to be imposed on us. We did our tax law. Any government can tax. Any government can. But the state of Canada has no authority to tax us as nations. We have done many laws, and they need to be amended because we were Russian trying to keep up with what Canada was doing and occupying that field of jurisdiction. Because don't forget, all laws of general application apply, subject to treaty and inherent rights. And we've never used treaty, but today we are. Child welfare, the legislation. We had to go into a tripartite agreement so that we can take over child welfare to keep our children at home. Then under the provincial legislation, under their authority, we had to give up that authority so the feds could give us monies to operate. Well, now it's going to change. We have been pursuing, or we're developing our own Child Welfare Act. We are pursuing treaty-based funding arrangements, and that's what we should all be doing. Treaty-based funding arrangements are just those monies that are being paid by the state of Canada for the promises of treaty. Then you look at the Declaration, utilize the Declaration, how they destroyed our institutions. Well, they got to help us. They got to pay those too. We have to make them do it. The treaty is still in existence. And Canada is a signatory to the International Covenant on Human Rights. We are human. We have those rights as well. So we've got an abundance of information, abundance of documents, statute, and declaration. We have declarations, everything that is there to support us. We need to get together and start helping one another and move on. We say no to the government of Canada. What can they do? They can't say anything. They cannot continue, we cannot allow them to use the AFN or other organizations to manipulate consent on our behalf. We, the treaty peoples, have to say yes. We, the citizens, have to support our leadership. Our leadership has to engage sessions with us, like you're doing here. We have to support them and provide the necessary support and direction that they need so we can move forward collectively. We might have different perspectives, and just because we got a different perspective doesn't mean we're fighting. We are looking for a solution. So that's, and I don't want to repeat myself, so those are the things that we got to look at. The treaty trumps all domestic legislation. The treaty is with the Imperial Crown, and it sets out a political relationship between the Crown settler people, Canada, and us. So we got to live side by side without interference. We have to make that happen and stop those interferences by the federal government. We got to stop the provincial government, who has no jurisdiction on us, no responsibility under treaty to continue imposing their laws on us. We have that authority. So let's work together and move forward. Thank you very much.